Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
A few years ago, I moved into a cozy little townhouse in the heart of the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but the rent was cheap, and it was within walking distance of my job. My unit faced a narrow alley, and directly across from me was an older, run-down apartment building. Most of the windows were dark, with the exception of one on the third floor. That window caught my eye the very first night. The light inside was dim and flickering, like it came from a dying bulb or an old TV. I couldn't make out much, but I could see a silhouette, a person sitting in a chair, always facing my direction. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just someone watching TV, and the angle made it look like they were staring at me. For the first few weeks, I tried to ignore it. I'd close my curtains, but curiosity always got the better of me. I'd peek out, and sure enough, the figure was still there. They never moved, never shifted, just sat there, facing my window. One night, after a particularly long day, I decided to confront my fear. I rationalized it in my head. Maybe it was a mannequin or a trick of the light. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened my window and shined the beam toward the third floor window. The light hit the glass, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a man, gaunt and pale, with sunken eyes and an unsettling grin stretched across his face. He didn't flinch or react to the flashlight. He just stared. I slammed my window shut, my heart racing. The next morning, I called the building's management, pretending to be a concerned neighbor. I asked about the occupant of that unit, but the manager told me the apartment had been empty for months. I didn't sleep that night, or any night after that, for a while. The light in the window never went out, and the figure never moved. I started to avoid looking at it altogether. About a month later, I was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud knock on my door. When I checked the peephole, no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, and lying on my doormat was a folded piece of paper. Written on it in shaky, scrawled handwriting were 4 words: I see you too. I moved out the next day. After moving out of that townhouse, I managed to find a place further uptown. It wasn't as cheap, but it had something my old home never did: peace of mind. At least, that's what I told myself. For months, I didn't see or hear anything strange. The light in the alley, the silhouette, the note, it all felt like a bad dream that had finally ended. I started to convince myself that maybe it was a prank or some overactive imagination on my part. Life went on. But then, about 6 months later, something happened that made it all come rushing back. It was a Sunday evening, and I was unpacking a box of old books that I'd never bothered to sort through since the move. At the bottom of the box was a framed photo of me and my younger sister, taken a couple of years earlier at a family reunion. We were standing in front of a large oak tree, grinning ear to ear. What caught my attention was something I hadn't noticed before. In the background of the photo, partially obscured by the tree, was a man. He was blurry, but the sunken eyes and unsettling grin were unmistakable. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing. How had I not seen this before? Was this some kind of sick coincidence, or had he been following me long before I'd even noticed? I showed the picture to my sister the next day. She didn't remember seeing anyone near us when the photo was taken, but as we talked, she hesitated, like she was holding something back. Finally, she said, "You know, I didn't want to scare you, but when I stayed at your old place that one weekend, I thought I saw someone outside your window. I didn't mention it because I thought it would freak you out." My stomach dropped. That was the same weekend I'd gone out of town for work. My sister had stayed there alone. After that, I became hyper aware of my surroundings. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, locking and relocking my doors, even checking under the bed like a kid afraid of monsters. It felt like paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The final straw came a few weeks ago. I was walking home from work late one night, cutting through a park to save time, and it was quiet, with only the faint hum of distant traffic. As I passed a line of trees, I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around, and there he was, the man from the window. He was standing about 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. His grin was wider than I'd ever seen, and his head was tilted at an unnatural angle. I froze, unable to move or breathe. Then, he stepped out from behind the tree. He raised his hand, and I thought for a moment he might be holding a weapon. But it wasn't. It was something much worse. He was holding my photo, the same one I'd found in that box, the one with him in the background. He held it up for me to see, and then he pointed at me. I ran in. I don't know how long I sprinted before I finally reached my apartment. I locked every door and window, called the police, and waited. They came quickly, but of course, by the time they searched the area, there was no sign of him. The officers tried to reassure me, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. me. They suggested it was just a random creep, but I knew better. I've since moved again, this time to a completely different city. I've changed my number, deleted all my social media, and told as few people as possible where I live. It's been a few months, and so far, I haven't seen him again, but every time I pass a window or catch my reflection in a darkened surface, I can't help but feel like he's still out there, watching. I wish I could tell you that moving to a new city ended the nightmare. For a while, I believed it had. I kept my life as low profile as possible, no social media, no predictable routines, nothing that could make me easy to track. But deep down, I knew that peace wouldn't last forever. It happened again 2 weeks ago. I'd been working late and decided to stop at a coffee shop near my new apartment to unwind before heading home. It was one of those places that stayed open late, with dim lighting and quiet music that made it feel cozy and safe. I settled into a corner booth, ordered a latte, and started flipping through a book. When I looked up from the pages, I saw him. He was outside the coffee shop, standing across the street under a street lamp. That same thin frame, sunken eyes, and unsettling grin. The moment I saw him, he raised his hand, not to wave, but to point. He pointed directly at me. My chest tightened as panic set in. I tried to act normal, not wanting to draw attention or make him realize I'd seen him. I picked up my phone and texted a friend, asking them to call me immediately. When my phone buzzed and I pretended to answer, I used the opportunity to slip out the back door of the coffee shop. I ran down the alley behind the building, weaving through side streets and alleys, trying to lose him. My heart was pounding, but I didn't stop until I was sure I hadn't been followed. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door, closed every curtain, and stayed up the entire night clutching a kitchen knife. The next morning, I called the police again, but the pattern was the same. They took a report, promised to look into it, and left me feeling like I was losing my mind. Then, yesterday, I found something that made my blood run cold. I came home from work to find an envelope wedged into my doorframe. My name was written on the front in that same shaky handwriting I'd seen before. I hesitated before opening it, dreading what I'd find inside. It was a photo. This time, it was a picture of me taken from outside my apartment. The angle suggested it had been snapped through my living room window. I was sitting on my couch, completely unaware that I was being watched. On the back of the photo was a single word: soon. I didn't sleep last night. Every creak of the building, every shadow in the corner of my eye felt like him. I packed a bag, left my apartment, and checked into a hotel on the other side of the city. I'm writing this from that hotel room, trying to figure out what to do next. I've been through this too many times to believe it'll stop. Moving hasn't worked. Hiding hasn't worked. He always finds me. This happened a few years ago when I was house sitting for my aunt and uncle while they went on a cruise. Their place was a nice, modern house in a quiet neighborhood, tucked away at the end of a dead-end street. The only odd thing about it was the overgrown, abandoned-looking house next door. Before they left, my aunt warned me, "You might hear strange noises from the house next door. It's been empty for years, but kids like to mess around there sometimes. Just ignore it, and they'll go away." I didn't think much of it at first. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I worked remotely during the day, spent my evenings watching movies, and went to bed early. It was peaceful. On the third night, though, I started hearing things. It began with a faint scratching noise, like someone dragging something across the pavement. I figured it was raccoons or maybe stray cats and went back to my movie. But as the night went on, the noises got louder. By midnight, I was hearing faint tapping on the windows at the side of the house. I felt a little uneasy, but I reminded myself about what my aunt had said. Probably kids being stupid. I turned on all the outdoor lights to show I was home and hoped they'd get bored and leave. The tapping stopped for a while, but then there was a loud thump at the back of the house. I froze. That wasn't a kid messing around. That was someone or something serious. Grabbing my phone, I tiptoed to the back door and flipped on the light. The yard was empty. I stared out into the shadows for a long moment, then double-checked the locks before heading to bed. I told myself I'd call the non-emergency line in the morning if anything else happened. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint but unmistakable, low, guttural voices coming from outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like they were arguing. I stayed perfectly still in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The voices got louder, and then I heard footsteps. They were moving around the side of the house, heading toward the front. Summoning my courage, I peeked out the window. I could barely see through the blinds, but I caught a glimpse of two figures standing on my lawn. One was tall and thin, and the other was shorter, hunched over like they were holding something heavy. I called the police. It felt like an eternity before the red and blue lights finally lit up the street. By the time the officers arrived, the figures were gone. I told them everything, and they searched the property but found no signs of forced entry or damage. They did, however, find a pile of broken glass near the side window, like someone had smashed a bottle there recently. The next morning, I decided to check out the house next door in daylight. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The front door was hanging open, and the inside was a wreck, graffiti on the walls, broken furniture, and a smell like mildew and rot. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange, a stack of Polaroid photos on the floor near the fireplace. They were pictures of my aunt and uncle's house. Some were from far away, taken from the overgrown yard. Others were close-ups of windows, including the one right next to the room where I'd been sleeping. I handed them over to the police, but nothing ever came of it. My aunt and uncle decided to put up a privacy fence and some security cameras, but I haven't house sat for them since. A few weeks after the incident, my aunt called me with a strange update. "Hey," she said hesitantly, "remember that night you called the police when you were here?" Of course, I replied, "What's going on?" "Well, the security cameras we installed, they've been picking up some weird stuff, mostly shadows and movements around the house next door. The cameras catch glimpses of people, different people, always late at night. It's like they come and go from that place. We showed some of the footage to the police, but they still can't do much because it's private property." I didn't know what to say. It sounded like the creepy house next door wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. And then she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Last night, we got footage of someone standing in our yard, right by the back door. Chills ran down my spine. What did they do? Nothing. They just stood there for over an hour. They didn't try to get in or anything. They just stared at the house. The police checked it out, but by the time they got here, the person was long gone. I didn't sleep that night, even though I was miles away from their house. A month later, my aunt and uncle decided to sell the place. They never told their real estate agent about the strange activity next door. They just wanted to get out as quickly as possible. The last time I visited their new house, my uncle shared something he hadn't told me before. "You know that stack of Polaroids you found? The ones you gave to the police?" "Yeah. Well, after we moved out, they mailed them back to us. Said it wasn't enough evidence to link to any crime. I didn't understand why they'd send them back, but he went on. When we looked at them again, we noticed something we hadn't seen before. In one of the photos at the living room window, there's a face reflected in the glass. And it's not yours, or mine, or your aunt's." I felt cold all over. "What kind of face?" He hesitated. "It was wrong. Just wrong. The proportions were off. Like the eyes were too big and the smile was too wide. It looked like it was grinning. They destroyed the Polaroids after that. I couldn't blame them. To this day, I think about that house. Who were the people creeping around? What was their connection to the abandoned property? And most of all, what was the thing in the photo?" A few years passed, and the eerie memories of that house faded into the background of my life. My aunt and uncle seemed happy in their new place, and I stopped bringing it up whenever we talked. I thought I had put the whole thing behind me until a few weeks ago. I was scrolling through a local community group on social media when I saw a post that stopped me cold. It was a blurry picture of the same abandoned house next to my aunt and uncle's old property. The caption read, "Anyone know what's going on here? People keep hearing strange noises and seeing lights at night. This house has been empty for decades, right?" The comments were a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some people claimed it was just local kids playing pranks, while others swore they'd seen weird figures around the property late at night. A few brave souls said they tried to explore the house, but they always felt watched and left before getting far. I couldn't stop myself. I sent the poster a message asking if they'd seen anything unusual themselves. They replied almost immediately, "Yeah, it's creepy as hell. My dog refuses to walk past that house. A few weeks ago, I was walking him late at night, and I swear I saw someone standing in the upstairs window. But when I looked again, they were gone. That familiar chill ran down my spine. I wanted to let it go, but something about the house wouldn't let me. Against my better judgment, I decided to drive by it the next day. When I pulled up to the end of the dead-end street, I barely recognized the neighborhood. My aunt and uncle's old house had been sold again, and the new owners had built a taller fence. The abandoned house next door looked even worse than I remembered. Windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, and an air of decay that seemed to cling to it like a shadow. As I sat there in my car, staring at the house, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly open, swaying in the breeze. A faint metallic clinking noise echoed from inside, like chains rattling. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I should drive away and forget about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. And then I saw it, a face in the upstairs window. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The same distorted features my uncle had described, the too wide smile and impossibly large eyes. My heart raced as I fumbled to start my car, and as I pulled away, I swore I saw movement in the doorway. That night, I had nightmares about the house. In my dreams, the face in the window wasn't just watching me, it was inside my own home, staring at me from the corner of the room. The next day, I called my aunt. I hadn't told her what I'd seen, but I needed to hear her voice to ask if she'd heard anything strange strange about the house since they'd moved away. "We don't talk about that place anymore," she said firmly. "Whatever's there, it's not our problem, and it's better that way." When I was 15, my family moved to a quiet suburb in the Midwest. Our new house was old but charming, sitting at the end of a cul-de-sac on Thornridge Lane. Across the street was a dilapidated house no one seemed to know much about. Overgrown weeds surrounded it, and the windows were always dark. My parents said it had been abandoned for years. The first time I noticed anything odd was on a chilly October evening. I was in my room doing homework when I glanced out the window and saw a flicker of light in the abandoned house. It was faint, like someone walking with a candle or a lantern. I told my parents, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably kids messing around. A week later, I was taking out the trash when I saw a figure standing in the window of the house. It was just a silhouette, but it was clear they were watching me. I froze, staring back until I blinked, and they were gone. My heart pounded as I rushed back inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft tapping on my bedroom window. My room was on the second floor. The sound was faint but deliberate, like fingernails on glass. I didn't dare look. I lay there, paralyzed, until the noise stopped. The next morning, I found a long scratch on the outside of the glass, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch from the nearby tree, though the tree was nowhere near the window. The final straw came a month later. My parents were out for the evening, and I was home alone watching TV. I heard a noise upstairs, a soft thud, like something had fallen. I muted the TV and listened. A few seconds later, I heard it again, this time closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and crept up the stairs. The hallway was dark, and the air felt heavy. I was almost to my room when I saw the door to the attic hatch was open. We never used the attic. My heart raced as I stepped back, unsure what to do. That's when I heard a soft, raspy whisper, "Come play." I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached a neighbor's porch. They called my parents, who came home immediately. My dad checked the attic but found nothing unusual. I told them what I'd heard, but they chalked it up to an overactive imagination and the eerie atmosphere of the neighborhood. We moved out a year later, and I never found out who or what had been in the attic. I still have nightmares about the voice, though, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I swear I hear soft tapping on my window. Years later, when I was in my mid-20s, I returned to the area for work. On a whim, I decided to drive down Thornridge Lane. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to see if the abandoned house was still there. To my surprise, it was gone. In its place was a neat, modern home with a well-maintained lawn and a for sale sign out front. The street looked completely different, cleaner, and more vibrant than I remembered. I parked my car at the end of the cul-de-sac and stared at the spot where the old house had once stood. I was about to drive away when an older woman walking her dog stopped by my car. Looking at the house, "Oh," she asked with a knowing smile. "Yeah," I replied. "I used to live on the street when I was a kid. That house used to be, well, different." Her expression changed. "You lived here when the Thornridge house was still standing?" I nodded. "Yeah, it always creeped me out. Honestly, do you know what happened to it?" She hesitated before speaking. "They tore it down about 5 years ago. Good riddance. That place had a reputation." "A reputation," I echoed, my stomach tightening. She glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "There were rumors, stories about strange things happening, people disappearing. Police investigated a few times, but they never found anything concrete. Then one day, the family who owned it just vanished, left everything behind. No one bought it after that. It just sat empty, rotting away." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you ever hear anything about someone living there while it was abandoned? Or, I don't know, weird noises?" The woman studied me for a moment before lowering her voice. "Some kids used to break in on dares. A few said they saw a man living in the attic, though no one ever proved it. Others claimed there were things, shadows that moved on their own. One boy swore he heard a voice whisper his name when he was alone in there." I thanked her and drove off, unsettled but trying to push it out of my mind. That night, back in my hotel room, I couldn't stop thinking about the attic door and the whisper I'd heard all those years ago. Before I fell asleep, I pulled out my laptop and searched for any news about the old Thornridge house. Buried in local archives, I found a few mentions of the place, complaints from neighbors about strange lights, reports of trespassing, and one article about a missing girl who was last seen near the property in the 1970s. But one detail made my blood run cold. In a grainy black and white photo of the house, I could just make out something in the attic window, a figure, blurry but unmistakable, watching the photographer. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. It was the same window where I'd seen the silhouette all those years ago. Whatever had been in that house hadn't left willingly, it had been forced out. I've never gone back to Thornridge Lane since, and sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that raspy voice in my ear, whispering, "Come play." After returning home from that unsettling trip, I did my best to move on, but the experience lingered. The whispers, the tapping, the attic door, I couldn't shake the memories. Worse, I started noticing small, inexplicable things in my own apartment. At first, it was minor, misplaced keys, doors left slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed them. Then, it escalated. I'd wake up to faint scratching sounds at my bedroom door. Once, I found my living room window unlocked, though I hadn't opened it in weeks. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m., my heart racing for no reason. The room was silent except for the soft hum of my fan. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. That's when I noticed it, a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. I froze, barely able to breathe. The figure was tall and hunched, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My mind raced. Was it a burglar? A hallucination? Before I could decide, it moved closer, slow and deliberate. Then I heard it. "Come play." The same raspy whisper, as if spoken directly into my ear. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I bolted from the bed, flipping on the light switch as I ran. The room was empty, the shadow gone. My bedroom door was still closed and locked. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I called a friend who was into the paranormal. I wasn't sure I believed in that sort of thing, but I was desperate for answers. When I described what had been happening, her face grew serious. "It sounds like you might have brought something back with you," she said. "Spirits or entities can attach themselves to people, especially if you've had a traumatic experience connected to them. What do I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. She suggested cleansing my apartment, burning sage, sprinkling salt at the doorways, and reciting a protective prayer. I felt ridiculous, but I followed her advice to the letter. For a while, it seemed to work. The noises stopped, and I felt a sense of relief. But 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on my window. I live on the 10th floor. I didn't look. I couldn't. I pulled the covers over my head and prayed until the tapping stopped. The next morning, I found a long scratch on the outside of the glass, just like the one on my childhood bedroom window. That's when I knew it wasn't bound to the house on Thornridge Lane. It was bound to me. I've moved twice since then, each time hoping to leave whatever this is behind. But no matter where I go, it always finds me. The whispers, the tapping, the scratches, they become a part of my life. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I do know one thing: I'll never go back to Thornridge Lane. And if you ever come across a house that seems off, that feels wrong in ways you can't explain, do yourself a favor. Stay away. This happened a few years ago when I was fresh out of college and had just moved into my first apartment. It was a cozy little one-bedroom in an old brick building on the edge of the city. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood quiet, and I thought I had lucked out. Little did I know, I was about to have the most terrifying experience of my life. The building was quaint, but it had its quirks. One of them was the old-fashioned radiator system that clanked and hissed in the dead of night. I quickly got used to the noise, chalking it up to the building's age. What I didn't know was that there was something far more sinister to get used to. One night, I was working late, finishing up some freelance graphic design work at my desk in the corner of the living room. The only light came from my laptop and a small desk lamp, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but the steady hum of the radiator kept me company. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't notice the faint sound at first. It was like a soft tapping, barely audible over the wind. I paused, listening intently, and the sound stopped. Shrugging it off as a branch hitting the window, I went back to work. About an hour later, the tapping returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. My heart started racing as I stood up and turned on the main light. I walked through the apartment, checking every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight. I told myself it must be the pipes or some other benign noise and tried to calm down. That's when I saw it. My apartment had an old hatch in the ceiling of the hallway that led to the attic crawl space. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to peer through. I had never noticed it before, assuming it was sealed shut. The tapping sound came again, louder now, unmistakably coming from the attic. I froze, panic setting in. My phone was on the desk, too far to grab without making noise. I didn't want whomever, or whatever, was up there to know I was aware of them. Slowly, I backed into my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering the situation to the dispatcher. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. I could hear faint shuffling sounds above me, like someone crawling on their hands and knees. At one point, I swear I heard breathing, low, shallow, and deliberate. When the officers arrived, I practically threw myself out the door to greet them. They searched the apartment thoroughly, then climbed into the attic. What they found still haunts me. There was a small nest of blankets, empty food wrappers, and a notebook filled with scribbled writing. Most of it was nonsense, random words and drawings, but some of the pages had my name written over and over, surrounded by phrases like watching her and she doesn't know. The officers told me that it appeared someone had been living in the attic for weeks, possibly months. They had been watching me through the gaps in the hatch, creeping down when I was out or asleep to steal food. Months passed after I moved out of that apartment. I settled into a new place, a modern building with secure locks, surveillance cameras, and absolutely no crawl spaces. I was doing everything I could to feel safe again, but the fear never really left me. I developed a habit of compulsively checking my windows and doors, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night to triple check the locks. Therapy helped a little, but the paranoia lingered. One night, I was scrolling through social media in bed when a notification popped up from an unfamiliar app I didn't remember downloading. It was called NeighborNet, and the notification read, "Someone in your area wants to connect." Curious but cautious, I opened the app. It seemed to be a local networking platform, like a neighborhood bulletin board. The message was from a user with no profile picture or name, just the username Watcher87. The message read, "Miss your old place." My blood ran cold. I immediately deleted the app, assuming it was some kind of sick prank, but the damage was done. That message burrowed into my mind, reopening the wounds of that terrifying experience. The next day, I visited the police station to report the message, but without any concrete evidence of who sent it, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay vigilant, which didn't do much to ease my anxiety. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place, nothing major, just little details. A chair pulled out, a cabinet door left open, a window unlocked when I was sure I had secured it. It was subtle enough that I started questioning my sanity. Was I imagining it, or had someone found me again? Then came the package. One evening, a small, unmarked box was left at my door. It had no return address, just my name written on the front in shaky handwriting. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single item, the notebook the police had found in the attic of my old apartment, the same one filled with my name and chilling phrases. I called the police immediately, but they couldn't find any fingerprints or clues on the box. The only thing they could do was increase patrols in my area. That night, I barely slept. I barricaded the door to my bedroom, clutching a heavy flashlight in case someone tried to break in. Around 3 a.m., I heard the tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the window in my living room. Heart pounding, I crept to the door and peeked into the living room. There, standing outside the window, was a figure. They were dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by a hoodie, but I knew it was them. The Watcher. They pressed something against the glass, a piece of paper, and then vanished into the night. I didn't move until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the courage to look at the paper, it was another note. It simply said, "Still watching. Even after moving to a new city, the anxiety never fully left me. I tried to start over, building a life where no one knew my past. New job, new friends, new routines. It helped, but there was always a part of me that stayed on edge. For a while, things were quiet. Months passed without incident, and I began to convince myself that maybe I was finally free. Maybe the Watcher had given up, or maybe they were caught doing something else. I'd even let myself laugh at the thought that I might be overreacting. But then, one evening, it happened again. I was walking home from work, cutting through a quiet parking in my apartment. It was just starting to get dark, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the path. I was lost in thought, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when I noticed a figure on the bench ahead. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was a public park, after all, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't sitting like a normal person. They were completely still, their head tilted slightly downward, as if they were waiting for me. I tried to keep my cool, avoiding eye contact as I walked past, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. In their lap was a notebook, and the way it was open, it was like they were reading something, writing something. I walked faster, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, even when I felt like their eyes were boring into the back of my head. By the time I reached my apartment, I was practically running. I locked the door, checked every window, and double-checked the deadbolts. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed to move. I told myself it was paranoia, that there was no way they had found me again. But the next morning, my doubts were erased. Sitting on my kitchen counter was a single sheet of paper. It hadn't been there the night before. My locks were intact, my windows still sealed, but the paper was there, and it wasn't mine. Scrawled in that same shaky handwriting were the words, "Nice park, nice life, see you soon." I didn't know how they got in, how they even knew where I lived, but one thing was clear, they weren't going to stop. I packed a bag and left that day, moving into a hotel while I figured out my next steps. This time, I didn't even tell my closest friends where I was going. I hired a private investigator to look into the situation, desperate for answers. Weeks turned into months as they searched for any trace of the Watcher. They checked my old apartments, followed leads, and even reviewed the surveillance footage from my new building. Nothing. It was as if the Watcher didn't exist. The investigator's final report came with a chilling conclusion. Whoever this was, they were careful. Too careful. They knew how to avoid being seen, how to stay one step ahead. They weren't just stalking me, they were playing a game, and they were winning. It's been a year since I received that last note. I've changed my name, my appearance, and my habits. I live off the grid as much as I can. No social media, no permanent address, no predictable routines. But every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something or someone that sends a shiver down my spine. I'm an experienced hiker and always take the necessary precautions, let someone know my route, pack extra supplies, and stick to trails. This time, I chose a path that wound through dense forest before opening up onto a stunning ridge overlooking a valley. I started early, wanting to reach the ridge by late afternoon for the best views. The first part of the hike was uneventful. I saw a few other hikers on the trail, but no one going my way. The forest was quiet, just the sound of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of wildlife. As I got closer to the ridge, the trail became steeper and narrower. The trees thinned out, and I began to feel the sun on my back. That's when I noticed something strange. Far ahead on the trail, I saw a figure. They were standing perfectly still, facing away from me, right at the edge of the ridge. I stopped in my tracks, unsure if I should call out. It's not unusual to run into other hikers, but this person's posture felt odd. They were just standing there, stiff as a statue, looking out over the valley. I decided to keep walking, albeit cautiously. As I got closer, I noticed they were wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, despite the warm weather. They didn't seem to have any hiking gear, no backpack, water bottle, nothing. Hey there, I called out as I approached, trying to sound friendly. They didn't respond or even acknowledge me. My stomach tightened, but I told myself they were probably just lost in thought. I gave them a wide berth as I passed, glancing at their face, or what I could see of it. The hood shadowed most of their features, but their jaw was set and their lips were pressed into a thin line. They didn't look at me. I reached the ridge and took a few photos of the view, though I couldn't fully relax. The person was still standing in the same spot, unmoving, about 20 feet away. It felt like they were watching me without actually looking at me, if that makes sense. The uneasy feeling in my gut intensified, so I decided to head back earlier than planned. I started down the trail, glancing over my shoulder occasionally. The person was still there, motionless. After about 10 minutes of brisk walking, I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle. That's when I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the ridge. My heart sank. I turned around and saw the same figure, now walking down the trail toward me. Their movements were steady, unhurried, like they knew exactly where I was going and weren't in a rush to catch up. Panic set in. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The trail wound through the forest again, and I hoped the trees would obscure me, but every so often, I'd hear the footsteps, closer than before. Finally, I saw another hiker coming up the trail toward me, a middle-aged man with trekking poles. I must have looked terrified because he immediately asked if I was okay. I told him someone was following me, and he offered to walk with me back to the trailhead. We didn't see the figure again, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after I got back to my car. I reported the encounter to a park ranger, but they didn't seem overly concerned, saying it was probably another hiker who meant no harm. After that encounter, I swore off solo hiking for a while. The experience stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Every time I thought about it, I could still hear the slow, deliberate footsteps and feel the oppressive sensation of being watched. About 6 months later, I joined a local hiking group. It was comforting to have company on the trails, and for a time, I managed to push the memory of that day aside. I chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps an awkward, antisocial hiker who didn't know how to act around others. That was until a group hiked to a different part of the same park. This trail was more popular, with plenty of hikers and families enjoying the mild weather. About halfway through, the path narrowed, leading us through a stretch of forest before opening onto another scenic ridge. We stopped for a break at the ridge, taking photos and chatting. I wandered a little further down the trail to get a better angle of the valley. That's when I saw it again, the figure. This time, it was partially obscured by trees, standing at the edge of a clearing. Same dark hoodie, same unnervingly stiff posture. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was just another hiker, but the way they stood, completely motionless, felt too familiar, too raw and tight. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The rest of my group was still behind me, out of sight but not too far. I could have run back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I wanted to know if it was the same person, or at least convince myself it wasn't. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps closer. Are you okay? Do you need help? Still no response, but this time, they turned their head ever so slightly, just enough for me to see part of their face. Pale skin, sunken eyes, and lips that curved into a subtle, unsettling grin. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't a look of friendliness. It was a look of recognition. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move, didn't follow, but the grin remained, like they were daring me to come closer. I bolted back to my group, nearly tripping over my own feet. I told them what I saw, but no one else had noticed anything unusual. A few suggested it was probably a park ranger or another hiker, but I knew better. That face, that grin, I'd seen it before. We finished the hike quickly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire way back. When we reached the trailhead, I scanned the parking lot for anything suspicious but saw nothing. Still, the sense of unease stayed with me. Months passed, but the memories of those encounters never really faded. I started to dream about the figure, always standing still, always watching, always just out of reach. Sometimes, in my dreams, they would move closer, but never quickly and never fully into view. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. The grin from that second meeting seared into my mind. My friends told me I was overthinking it, and maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the paranoia that it wasn't over. One day, a friend invited me to a local hiking seminar held at a community center. It was hosted by a ranger from the same national park and focused on backcountry safety. I figured it might be a good way to regain some confidence. Plus, I hoped hearing from the rangers would help rationalize what had happened on the trail. Maybe there was a logical explanation I hadn't considered. The seminar was uneventful at first. The rangers spoke about wildlife encounters, navigation tips, and what to do in emergencies. But near the end, they touched on trail etiquette and strange encounters. The ranger recounted a few anecdotes about odd or unnerving situations hikers have reported over the years, strange noises, shadowy figures, even rumors of ghostly sightings. Then, as if on cue, another attendee raised their hand. Have you heard about the figure in the hoodie? My stomach dropped. The ranger hesitated, glancing at the rest of the room before responding. I assume you're talking about the rumors we hear every so often. A few hikers have mentioned seeing someone or something that fits that description. Usually, they're described as standing still, watching from a distance. But he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Then what? Another attendee pressed. The ranger sighed. We've never found any evidence of this person. No tracks, no belongings, no signs anyone was even there. And in most cases, they reported in areas where it would be difficult to just disappear without leaving a trace. The room fell silent. I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Someone else asked if the park had ever investigated. The ranger explained that, while they took all reports seriously, there wasn't much they could do without solid evidence. The wilderness is vast, he said. It's not uncommon for people to feel uneasy out there. Your mic can play tricks on you. I wanted to speak up, to share my story, but I stayed silent. What if no one believed me? Worse, what if someone in the room did? The seminar ended shortly after, and I lingered near the exit, waiting for the crowd to thin out. The ranger was packing up his materials when I finally approached him. That figure people have seen. Do you think it's real? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He paused, then gave me a small, tired smile. Between you and me, I've worked here a long time. I don't believe in ghosts, but I've seen some things I can't explain. Just be careful out there. That night, I dreamed of the figure again, but this time, it wasn't just standing still. It was walking toward me, slowly but surely. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead, and the grin grew wider as it got closer. I woke up gasping for air, the sensation of being watched lingering in the dark corners of my bedroom. I haven't been hiking since. I'm not sure I ever will again. I live in a big city and work long hours, often leaving the office well after dark. My office is in a high-rise building, and on this particular night, I was one of the last to leave. It was almost 11 p.m., and the building was eerily quiet. Most floors were dark except for the faint glow of emergency exit signs. I pressed the elevator button and waited. The mirrored walls around the elevator bay reflected my tired, disheveled self. When the elevator finally arrived, the doors opened to reveal an empty car. I stepped in, pressed the ground floor button, and leaned back against the wall, letting out a sigh of relief that the day was over. The elevator began its smooth descent. It passed the 20th floor, then the 19th. As it reached the 18th floor, it jolted slightly and the doors slid open. There was no one there. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone had pressed the button and then decided to take the stairs. I reached over to press closed door, but as I did, I noticed something odd. A single black loafer, scuffed and worn, was lying on its side in the hallway just outside the elevator. It wasn't there when I got in, and the hallway was dead silent. Uneasy, I jabbed the close door button again, harder this time. The doors began to shut but paused as if something was blocking them. I stared at the floor seam, expecting to see a shoe or bag wedged in the gap. There was nothing there. Suddenly, the elevator lights flickered. My stomach dropped. When the doors finally shut and the car began moving again, it felt slower, almost as if the elevator was dragging its way downward. The mirrored walls didn't help my growing paranoia. I kept feeling like there was something in the car with me, just out of view. I turned around to face the back mirror, looking for, I don't know, something, but it was just me and my reflection. Then, at the 10th floor, the elevator stopped again. The doors opened with a soft ding. This time, the hallway lights were dimmer, almost flickering, and standing there, just beyond the threshold, was a man. He was wearing a suit that looked a size too big. His head tilted slightly as if he were trying to see something behind me. His face was pale, his eyes dark and unblinking. Floyd down, he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Before I could respond, he stepped forward, but instead of entering the elevator, he stopped just inside the doors. His face now inches from mine. His eyes never left mine, and his lips stretched into a slow, unnatural smile. I backed into the corner, my hand scrambling for the door close button. The door stuttered shut, and the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, even as the doors closed completely. I was shaking, my breath quick and shallow. The elevator moved again, and I prayed I'd reach the ground floor without stopping. The lights flickered more now, casting weird, jerky shadows around the small space. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the cables, the hum of the motor, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Finally, the elevator reached the lobby. When the doors opened, I bolted out, not even looking back. I ran straight to the security desk, but it was empty. The entire lobby was empty. I didn't wait around to find out more. I called a rideshare and stood outside in the freezing air, under the glow of a street lamp, until it arrived. The next day, I asked the building manager if they'd had issues with the elevator or power outages the previous night. He looked confused and said no. I also described the man I'd seen, but no one matching that description worked in the building or had been seen on security footage. The story didn't end there. I wish it had. A week after the elevator incident, I was still shaken. I kept convincing myself that it was just a prank, or maybe I was overly tired and imagined things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started taking precautions. I told a few close friends about what happened, though I left out some of the creepier details. I didn't want them to think I was losing it. One of them suggested I report it to building security again, just in case. So I did. They were polite, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. A few nights later, I had to stay late at work again. I promised myself I'd leave earlier, but as deadlines tend to go, I lost track of time. By the time I packed up and headed for the stairs, it was almost midnight. The stairwell was silent, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing. I'd made it down about 5 floors when I started to hear something faint, like shuffling. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my steps bouncing back at me, but then it grew louder and more distinct. Someone else was in the stairwell. I stopped and listened, my heart racing. The shuffling sound stopped too, like whoever it was had noticed me. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the heavy, suffocating silence of the empty stairwell. I forced myself to keep moving, faster this time. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, but I didn't see anyone. Yet, the shuffling started again, closer now, almost rhythmic, like someone dragging their feet deliberately. I turned a corner onto another landing and froze. Lying on the floor was another black loafer, the same kind I'd seen outside the elevator. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to move past it, but going back up wasn't an option either. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed a friend, someone I knew would answer no matter the time. Hello, she said, groggy but concerned. I whispered, stay on the line. I think someone's following me. She immediately perked up, asking where I was and if she should call the police. I told her I was in the stairwell and needed to get to the lobby. Run, she said firmly. I did. I took the steps 2 at a time, the sound of my footsteps drowned out by the blood pounding in my ears. Behind me, the shuffling grew louder, faster, more erratic, like whoever or whatever was chasing me had started running too. I didn't dare look back. I burst through the door into the lobby, expecting relief, but instead, I was greeted by the same eerie emptiness. The security desk was abandoned again, the lights dimmer than usual. My friend was still on the phone, yelling for me to get outside. I sprinted across the marble floor toward the exit. As I reached the glass doors, I glanced at my reflection in the glass and froze. In the reflection, standing just behind me, was the man in the oversized suit. He wasn't smiling this time. His face was blank, almost hollow, and his eyes looked wrong, like they didn't belong on a human face. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I didn't stop to think. I ran outside and kept running until I was several blocks away, where I finally stopped to catch my breath under the harsh glow of a streetlight. My friend was still on the phone, panicked and begging me to explain what was happening. I never went back to that office building. I quit my job the next day, explaining it away as burnout. I never told anyone else what I saw in the glass or heard in the stairwell. well. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I hear it again, that faint, rhythmic shuffling. You think quitting the job would have been the end of it, that moving on would have been enough to leave whatever it was behind. But I was wrong. The first time I noticed something, I was walking home late from a friend's apartment. I'd stayed longer than I intended, trying to shake off the lingering fear that had followed me since that night in the office building. It was raining lightly, and the streets were mostly empty. I had just turned the corner onto my block when I saw it. A single black loafer. It was lying on the sidewalk near a street lamp, glistening with rain. My stomach churned, and I froze mid-step. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The street was silent except for the rain tapping against the pavement. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Lots of people lose shoes, right? Maybe someone kicked it off in a drunken stumble home. I forced myself to keep walking, avoiding the loafer like it was toxic. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked every window. That night, I dreamed of the man in the oversized suit. In the dream, I was back in the elevator. The walls were mirrored as always, but my reflection wasn't mine. It was him. He was grinning again, that slow, unnatural smile that made my skin crawl. I tried to look away, but no matter where I turned, his face was there, staring back at me. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My apartment felt colder than usual, like someone had left a window open, but everything was locked tight. Over the next few weeks, the signs became harder to ignore. I'd see black loafers in random places, a single shoe sitting in an alley, on a park bench, or at the edge of a crosswalk. Once, I found one on the welcome mat outside my apartment door. I wanted to believe it was some kind of cruel prank, but no one I knew would do something like this. Then there were the noises. It started faintly, like shuffling footsteps outside my door late at night. I checked the peephole, but no one was ever there. Sometimes, I'd hear it inside my apartment, soft, deliberate steps on the hardwood floor when I was lying in bed. I'd bolt upright, car hammering, but the sounds would stop as soon as I turned on the lights. I started sleepy with a knife under my pillow. The final straw came about a month after I'd quit my job. I was leaving my apartment one morning, trying to shake off another sleepless night, when I noticed something taped to my door. It was an old photograph, the kind you'd see from the 70 seconds, faded and yellowed around the edges. The photo was of a man in a suit. It wasn't oversized this time. It fit him perfectly. His face, though, was the same pale, hollow expression I'd seen in the elevator. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes seemed to peer straight through the photo. Scrawled in shaky handwriting across the bottom were the words, "You're next." I moved out that same day. I didn't pack much, just grabbed what I could carry and left. I stayed with a friend for a while, then couch hopped until I found a new place. I changed my phone number, cut ties with almost everyone who knew my address, and even started going by a nickname. It's been 6 months now, and I haven't seen a black loafer or heard shuffling footsteps since. I want to believe it's over, that whatever haunted me has moved on. But sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I catch the faintest glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A figure standing still in the distance, watching me. This happened about 2 years ago when I was living in a small city with an old, nearly abandoned subway system. Most people didn't use it anymore unless they absolutely had to. It was poorly lit, smelled like mildew, and was generally the kind of place where you kept your head down and your wits about you. One night, I had to work late, and by the time I got to the station, it was almost midnight. The platform was empty except for a few flickering lights and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. I stood near the edge, trying not to think about how eerie the place felt. The train finally arrived, the screech of the brakes echoing through the tunnel. When the doors slid open, I hesitated. The car was empty, save for a man sitting at the far end. He was wearing a long, tattered coat and a hat pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, and weird people use the subway all the time, and I got on and sat a few rows away from him, trying to focus on my phone. As the train started moving, I noticed him staring at me. Not glancing, staring. His head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to figure something out. I decided to ignore him. Then he did something strange. He stood up and moved to a seat closer to me. There were plenty of empty seats, but he chose one that was uncomfortably close. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but my gut was screaming at me to stay alert. The train rattled through the tunnels, and I realized I didn't hear his footsteps when he moved. The car was silent except for the clatter of the wheels. I risked a glance in his direction, and that's when I noticed something truly horrifying. His face was wrong. It was too pale, like like he hadn't seen sunlight in years, and his eyes, God, his eyes were too large, with dark rings around them. They didn't seem human. His mouth was slightly open, and his lips didn't move, but I swear I heard a whisper, a single word, stay. I shot to my feet and moved toward the door, gripping the pole so tightly my knuckles turned white. The train was approaching the next station, and I told myself I'd get off no matter what. As the train slowed, I glanced back. He was standing now, his head tilted even more, and he was grinning, but the grin was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. The doors opened, and I bolted out of the car, running up the stairs 2 at a time. I didn't look back until I was out on the street, gasping for air under a street lamp. The station was empty, and the train had already pulled away. After that night, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I'd been tired, overworked, and maybe I had misinterpreted what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, really wrong. The nightmare started a few days later. In my dreams, I was always back on that train. The flickering lights cast strange shadows on the walls, and the man was there, sitting closer and closer each time. His grin would stretch wider, his whisper louder, stay. I woke up in cold sweats every night, the sound of that word echoing in my ears. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped going out after dark. I even stopped taking public transportation entirely, opting to walk or carpool instead. But then, something happened that made me realize it wasn't just a bad dream. One morning, I left my apartment to head to work. My building has a long hallway that leads to the front door, and as I turned the corner, I froze. There, at the far end of the hall, was a dark smudge on the wall. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a smudge, it was a handprint. A long, pale handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wall and dragged it downward. The size of the handprint was rugged. The fingers were too long, the shape distorted. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was a maintenance worker, I told myself. Maybe someone had spilled something, and it just looked strange. But things only got worse. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more oddities. Items in my apartment were moved ever so slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to know they weren't where I'd left them. My door would be unlocked when I was certain I'd locked it, and sometimes, late at night, I'd hear fate whispering outside my window, like someone was speaking just below the edge of hearing. One night, the whispering got louder. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it stay, clear as day, right outside my living room window. My blood ran cold. I live on the 4th floor. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the middle of my apartment with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife and praying for morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed a bag and left. I didn't even care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I stayed with a friend across town for a while, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep on her couch, I heard the faint sound of whispering again, coming from the corner of the room. I didn't dare look, but I knew it was him or whatever it was. Even now, in this new city, far from that subway and those whispering nights, I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I've developed habits I never had before, triple checking my locks, keeping the blinds closed, avoiding empty places, and refusing to stay out after dark. It's not paranoia, it's survival. For a while, things were quiet. Too quiet, almost. I started to convince myself that maybe I had escaped it, that whatever that thing was, it had lost interest. But deep down, I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And, of course, it did. A few months ago, I got a package in the mail. It didn't have a return address, but the postmark was from my old city. That alone made my stomach twist. I hadn't told anyone where I was moving, not even my coworkers at my old job. My friends and family knew, but they didn't have my new address yet. I was still settling in. I stared at the package for a long time, debating whether to open it. Finally, I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut it open. Inside was a single, crumpled subway ticket. It looked old, the edges worn and stained, but what sent chills down my spine was the date printed on it. It was the date of that night, the night I saw him on the train. I threw the ticket away immediately, but it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small things again. Scratches on the walls of my apartment that hadn't been there before. A faint smell of mildew, like the air in the subway tunnels. And then, one night, I found something on my kitchen counter that made my heart stop. It was a single, pale handprint, smeared in something dark and sticky. I don't know what it was, dirt, oily, bloody. I didn't want to find out. I cleaned it up, but the next morning, it was back in the exact same spot. I started sleepy with the lights on again, and I didn't leave my apartment after sunset. But it didn't matter. The whispering started up again, faint at first, like it was coming from the walls themselves. Then louder, closer, stay. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against my bedroom door. It was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging along the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then I heard it again, that awful whisper coming from right outside the door. Stay. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, but eventually the sound stopped. When the sun rose, I packed another bag and left. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. I drove for hours, not caring where I ended up, until I found a small motel off the highway and checked in. I've been living out of motels and short-term rentals ever since, moving every few weeks. It doesn't feel like enough, though. The nightmares are back, and every so often, I find something that doesn't belong, an unfamiliar smudge on a wall, a faint mildew smell, or, worst of all, a whisper in the dark. I don't know what it wants or why it's following me, but I know one thing for certain, it's patient. It's waiting, and someday, no matter how far I run, it will catch up to me. This happened about 5 years ago when I was working late in a university library. I was a graduate assistant in the history department, which often meant spending long nights cataloging dusty old books and digitizing archival materials. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved the quiet and solitude. The archive room was in the basement of the humanities building, a place few people ventured. It had that eerie hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of mildew that seems to cling to old paper. The only other person who worked down there was a custodian named Reggie, and I rarely saw him. One evening, I was engrossed in scanning a collection of 19th century letters. The building had emptied out hours ago, and I had my headphones on, listening to a podcast. I barely noticed when the lights flickered, something they occasionally did in that old building. It was around 11 p.m. when I took off my headphones to stretch. That's when I heard it, faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the rows of shelves. I froze. No one else was supposed to be down here. Reggie, I called out, trying to sound casual but feeling the hair on my neck rise. No response. I waited, straining to hear. The footsteps had stopped, and shaking it off as my imagination, I returned to my work. But a few minutes later, I heard something else, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. This time, I stood up, my heart pounding. Hello, I called out. Louder this time. Is someone there? Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, walking toward the sound. The rows of shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in the dim light. When I reached the end of the row, I found nothing, just old books and boxes of documents. Feeling unnerved, I decided to pack up and leave. As I turned back toward my workstation, I noticed something that stopped me cold, a single book lying in the middle of the floor. It hadn't been there earlier. The title was obscured, but it looked ancient, its leather cover cracked with age. I approached cautiously and picked it up. The title read, The Watchers Among Us. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd never seen this book in the archive before. Deciding I'd had enough, I shoved the book onto a nearby shelf and hurried back to my desk to grab my things. As I was zipping up my bag, I heard it again, footsteps. But this time, they were faster, heavier, and coming straight toward me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I bolted for the exit, my bag swinging wildly behind me. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder and saw a shadow, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the end of the aisle. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just stood there. I slammed the door shut and ran up the stairs, not stopping until I was outside in the cold night air. I called campus security, who searched the archive room but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone else being down there. Even the book, The Watchers Among Us, was gone. After quitting the job, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination or maybe some weird prank. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with that archive room, and I wanted to forget about it. Months passed, and life moved on. I landed another job in a different department at the university, one that thankfully didn't involve basements or late nights. For a while, everything felt normal again. Then one day, I received a package at my office. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar, slanted, almost jagged. Inside the package was a single item, the book The Watchers Among Us. My heart sank. This time, the book wasn't aged or cracked. It looked brand new. Its leather cover was smooth, and the pages smelled freshly printed. I flipped it open, expecting nothing but blank pages or meaningless text. But on the first page, and the same jagged handwriting as the package label, was a single message: You left something behind. My chest tightened as I flipped through the rest of the book. The pages were filled with entries, dates, times, and detailed descriptions of events. My events. The night in the archive room was there, described in chilling detail, down to my frantic sprint to the exit. But it didn't stop there. The entries continued, describing moments from my life since then, walking to work, sitting at my desk, grocery shopping. The most recent entry was dated the night before. It read, She locks the windows now. Smart, but she forgot the one in the kitchen. I dropped the book as if it burned me. My hands were trembling, my thoughts racing. I lived alone alone. I had locked the windows the night before, but I had forgotten the kitchen one. I was sure of it now. I immediately called campus security, who connected me to the local police. An officer came to my apartment to check things out. Nothing seemed out of place. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside, just the book on my desk, innocuous and closed. The officer took the book with him, promising to investigate, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Probably just a weird prank. He said, try not to worry, try not to worry. Easier said than done. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. When I finally returned home a few days later, I found something waiting for me. Not another book this time, but a photograph. It was tucked under my apartment door. The photo was of me sitting at my desk in the archive room, headphones on, completely absorbed in my work. But what made my blood run cold was the reflection in the glass cabinet behind me. The tall, gaunt figure was there, standing silently, watching me. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer. I moved across the state, changed my phone number, and even left social media. I've done everything I could to erase myself from the public eye. It's been 2 years since I left that life behind. 2 years of trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For a while, I thought I'd succeeded. The footsteps outside my window stopped. No more mysterious packages, no strange books or photographs. I even started sleepy with the lights off again. But recently, the sense of unease has returned. It started small, a feeling of being watched when I was out running errands, an occasional fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was paranoia. Then, last week, I found another photograph. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. At first, I thought it was just a flyer until I saw the image. It was me again, this time taken through the window of my new apartment. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, completely unaware. My blood ran cold as I noticed the timestamp in the corner, 1:37 a.m. the night before. I had blackout curtains. Whoever took the photo was inside. I immediately called the police. They swept the apartment and found no sign of forced entry. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. The officers were sympathetic but clearly skeptical. Could be a prank, one of them said, echoing the words I'd heard 2 years ago. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt personal. I decided to stay with my sister for a while. Our house is in a gated community with security cameras everywhere. It felt safer. But the first night I was there, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple: you can't hide forever. Attached to the message was a live photo, a short video clip of me sleeping in my sister's guest room. The camera angle was low, as if the person had been crouching at the foot of the bed. I could see myself in real time, shifting in my sleep. Panic 7. I woke my sister, and we called the police again. They arrived quickly, but whoever had been there was long gone. The gates and cameras hadn't caught anything unusual, no signs of forced entry again. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. Since that night, I've been living in a kind of limbo, constantly on edge. I sleep during the day and stay awake at night, keeping watch. I've installed cameras and alarms everywhere, but they don't help. Whoever this is, they're always a step ahead. A few days ago, I found something new on my doorstep. It wasn't a book or a photograph this time. It was a small leather-bound journal, identical to the one I found in the archive room years ago. When I opened it, the pages were blank except for the last one. In the same jagged handwriting as before, there was a single sentence: "You brought me with you." I don't know what that means, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in that archive room, it didn't just find me. I think it's been with me all along. If you ever feel that faint prickle on the back of your neck, the sense that someone is watching you from the shadows, don't ignore it. And if you ever come across a book called The Watchers Among Us, leave it where you found it. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.